In the late summer of 1942, when the sun dipped below the industrial skyline of the Ruhr and the factory sirens fell silent for the night shift, a different sound began to carry across the darkness. Low at first, almost indistinguishable from distant wind, then steady, mechanical, growing into a vibration that pressed against the ribs of anyone standing beneath it. German reports would later describe this sound clinically as incoming hostile air activity. But private diaries and staff memoranda reveal that it was experienced differently. It was not merely an aircraft. It was anticipation. American bombers would come by day, invisible formations, silver shapes against blue sky, escorted by fighters, predictable in their approach even when devastating in effect. But British aircraft came at night. They arrived when visibility collapsed and radar screens flickered uncertainly. They arrived when men were already fatigued, when perception narrowed and imagination widened. The German command feared daylight destruction. They feared night disorientation more. In the early years of the air war, German leadership had invested enormous confidence in its defensive grid. The Kammhuber Line, an intricate network of radar stations, searchlight belts, anti-aircraft batteries, and night fighter sectors, was designed to create controlled interception corridors. It functioned efficiently under ideal conditions. But British doctrine evolved deliberately to fracture those conditions. RAF Bomber Command began to concentrate aircraft into tight bomber streams, compressing hundreds of planes into narrow corridors that overwhelmed radar tracking capacity. German controllers, trained to vector individual fighters toward single targets, suddenly faced a swarm that moved like a flood through their defensive channels. Operational reports from Luftwaffe night fighter units began using a new vocabulary: saturation, overload, congestion. These were not words of collapse. They were words of strain. Strain accumulates differently at night. During daylight raids, German commanders could see the enemy. Fighter pilots rose to meet them. Flak gunners tracked formation lines across the open sky. Even in loss, there was clarity. At night, clarity dissolved. Searchlights cut cones through darkness, intersecting clouds and smoke without guarantee of illumination. Radar operators stared at scopes that bloomed with echoes, some real, some deceptive. When the British introduced window, thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to create false radar signatures. The illusion deepened. In July 1943, during the Hamburg raids, radar screens were described as snowblind, cluttered beyond interpretation. A German staff officer recorded bluntly, "Control lost in sectors where interference persists." Control, not damage, was the operative concern. Damage could be assessed at dawn. Control, once shaken, undermined confidence in the system itself. The German High Command understood that the RAF strategy exploited more than darkness. It exploited rhythm. War functions on cycles: alert, engagement, recovery. Daylight bombing fits within that pattern. Sirens sounded. Fighters launched. Bombers passed. Damage was surveyed. Night bombing erased the boundary between engagement and recovery. Crews manned stations through extended hours. Searchlight operators endured cold winds and drifting clouds. Radar technicians recalibrated continuously. Civilians descended into shelters not knowing when sirens would fall silent. In diaries preserved after the war, factory managers described workers arriving for morning shifts without sleep, machinery handled by hands that trembled from fatigue rather than fear alone. German command began to recognize that British night operations targeted the interval between battles, the fragile space where endurance is rebuilt. The fear was not theatrical. It was cumulative. Reports from air defense districts across Western Germany began noting increased nervous activity, even on nights when no major raid occurred. Distant thunder was mistaken for engines. Passing aircraft unrelated to bombing missions triggered precautionary alerts. This anticipatory anxiety strained resources. Anti-aircraft batteries rotated crews more frequently. Night fighter pilots logged extended standby hours. Fuel consumption rose as interceptors launched against incomplete information. One Luftwaffe memorandum acknowledged that defensive sustainability at night was more demanding per engagement hour than during daylight operations. That phrasing is technical, but its implication is clear. the night cost more in attention and stamina. American bombers inflicted staggering material damage in daylight. Entire oil facilities and ball-bearing plants were reduced to rubble under visible formations. But British night operations eroded something less tangible, the sense that the Reich governed its own hours. Darkness had once been an ally. It concealed movement, shielded industry, and offered reprieve. Now it has become contested territory. German officers who had served since the early Blitzkrieg campaigns understood that tempo was decisive in war. Whoever dictates tempo controls momentum. And increasingly, the tempo of the air war did not pause with sunset. In high-level conferences in Berlin and regional command posts, discussions of RAF activity carried a different tone than those of American raids. American formations were formidable opponents. Their destruction was measurable. British night operations were described as persistent. The word recurs in documents. Persistent activity, persistent harassment, persistent disruption. Persistence breeds fatigue. Fatigue breeds miscalculation. And miscalculation, in a war already expanding on multiple fronts, carried consequences far beyond bomb craters. By late 1943 and into 1944, German command began allocating disproportionate defensive assets to nocturnal airspace. Radar coverage expanded. Flak towers in major cities were reinforced. Night fighter squadrons received priority in training and maintenance. Yet despite these measures, British aircraft continued to penetrate. Not always in overwhelming numbers. Not always with catastrophic effect. But consistently. The consistency mattered more than spectacle. It meant that every sunset carried uncertainty. It meant that defensive crews could not predict relief. It meant that commanders drafting operational plans did so knowing that the hours allocated for rest or reorganization might be interrupted. German command feared British night operations not because they were more visible than American bombers, but because they were less so. Visibility allows confrontation. Invisibility invites imagination. And imagination, in prolonged war, is often more corrosive than impact. By 1944, the fear had matured into doctrine. German command no longer treated British night operations as episodic bombardment. They treated them as a sustained campaign designed to bend time itself. In staff briefings of Luftwaffe Reich and regional air defense commands, the language became more analytical, less reactive. British raids were described not merely in terms of tonnage dropped, but in terms of operational continuity. The phrase appears repeatedly in memoranda reviewing the impact of nocturnal attacks on rail networks, oil storage depots, and synthetic fuel plants. What German planners began to grasp was that British night operations did not aim only to destroy infrastructure. They aimed to deny recovery. American daylight bombers could devastate a refinery in hours. British night operations ensured that the same refinery could not be repaired efficiently, that workers would approach the site exhausted, that transport lines bringing materials would be disrupted under cover of darkness. The fear was structural. In German industrial regions such as the Ruhr and Hamburg, the rhythm of daily life became distorted. Civil defense logs reveal that air raid sirens frequently sounded after midnight, sometimes in successive waves. Shelter occupancy reports show families spending entire nights underground, emerging at dawn to smoke-filled streets and shattered windows. For German command, this civilian dimension was not secondary. It was strategic. Morale sustained production. Production sustained the front. When British bombers approached unseen across cloud cover, marked targets with Pathfinder flares, and released bombs guided by radar systems like H-2S, they struck not only factories but predictability. German night fighter commanders complained in private diaries that interceptions were increasingly difficult due to RAF electronic countermeasures. Window, first deployed in 1943, remained a persistent irritant. Strips of foil drifting through the sky created phantom formations on radar screens. Controllers attempting to vector fighters through this interference often found themselves chasing illusions. One night fighter officer described the sensation as hunting in fog while blindfolded. The phrase was not theatrical. It was precise. Radar was the backbone of German nocturnal defense. When radar could be deceived, confidence in command and control faltered. American bombers, by contrast, announced themselves with scale. Their formations were visible long before reaching target zones. German fighters could be massed in response. Flak could be concentrated. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the engagement was tangible. Night operations dissolved tangibility. Even when RAF bombers were intercepted and destroyed, their approach often remained partially obscured. German searchlight crews wrote of beams catching only fragments of fuselage or contrails vanishing into clouds. Flak gunners fired at coordinates rather than silhouettes. The psychological distinction was subtle but critical. To see one's enemy is to define him. To fire into darkness is to confront uncertainty. German command increasingly recognized that British night operations imposed cumulative strain on personnel. Night fighter pilots flew sorties in cramped cockpits guided by ground instructions that could degrade mid-mission. Radar operators strained over flickering scopes for hours. Anti-aircraft crews rotated through freezing temperatures, their alertness dulled by fatigue. After-action reports show rising instances of misidentification and accidental friendly fire under nocturnal conditions. Such errors eroded trust in the defensive grid. Trust, once diminished, cannot be restored by numbers alone. Beyond bombing cities, RAF night intruder missions began targeting Luftwaffe airfields and transportation nodes deep within occupied Europe. German airfield logs from France and the Low Countries detail strafing runs against returning night fighters as they attempted to land. Maintenance crews, working under blackout restrictions, faced sudden bursts of tracer fire that turned runways into exposed corridors. The implication was clear. Even the defenders were vulnerable in darkness. This inversion unsettled German command profoundly. Air superiority had once implied sanctuary at home bases. British night operations dismantled that assumption. By late 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet offensives, and Allied ground forces were advancing toward Germany's western borders. German high command was forced to prioritize resources ruthlessly. Yet even in this moment of existential crisis, significant manpower and material remained tied to nocturnal air defense. The reason was not sentiment. It was calculation. Night operations magnified systemic weakness. They disrupted rail schedules transporting reinforcements. They delayed fuel shipments vital to armored divisions. They forced cities into perpetual readiness, draining both morale and administrative bandwidth. Internal memoranda reveal a recurring concern. Night pressure is unsustainable if maintained at present frequency. The phrase is understated, but its meaning is stark. German command feared that the RAF's ability to maintain relentless nocturnal tempo could fracture defensive cohesion long before daylight offensives achieved final breakthroughs. American bombers represented visible industrial might. British night operations represented endurance, an endurance that chipped away at Germany's own. Darkness, once a strategic ally, had become a contested domain in which the Reich could not assert dominance. The fear was no longer limited to bomb damage. It extended to the realization that every sunset marked the beginning of another test, one that stretched nerves, systems, and belief in control. And control in total war was as vital as steel or oil. The distinction between destruction and destabilization became clearer to German command as the war entered its final, unforgiving phase. By early 1945, the Reich was fighting on multiple collapsing fronts, yet night operations continued to exert pressure that was disproportionate to their visible aftermath. In intelligence briefings circulated among Luftwaffe and Army Group staff officers, RAF activity was increasingly described not simply as bombing but as operational harassment with sustained strategic implications. That language, technical and restrained, concealed a deeper anxiety. Harassment implies irritation. Sustained harassment implies erosion. German commanders feared erosion more than spectacle. In daylight, American bomber formations could be tracked across the channel, intercepted by fighters, and engaged in aerial battles that, though costly, followed recognizable patterns. German officers could review sortie reports and calculate losses against production metrics. Night operations denied that clarity. British aircraft rarely presented the enemy with concentrated visual formations. Instead, they arrived as sound first. a distant hum beneath cloud cover, then as flares that painted the sky in unnatural colors before bombs fell. The unpredictability of target marking compounded defensive confusion. Pathfinder units sometimes illuminated decoy sites, intentionally diverting attention and flak concentration. German flak batteries would expend ammunition at phantom targets while actual bomb loads descended elsewhere. The result was not merely tactical frustration but psychological displacement. If the defensive network could be deceived so easily, what confidence remained in its precision? The German command understood that morale underpins endurance. In post-war interrogations, several former Luftwaffe officers admitted that night raids unsettled civilian populations in ways daylight raids did not. Daylight brought visible confrontation, fighter duels in the sky, plumes of smoke rising in defiance. Night brought invisibility. Civilians heard engines overhead without seeing them. They descended into shelters uncertain whether the attack would be brief or prolonged. Industrial workers emerged at dawn to streets lit by embers rather than sunlight. This nocturnal rhythm deprived Germany of psychological reset. The Reich's propaganda apparatus could frame daylight engagements as heroic defense against visible invaders. It struggled to frame unseen adversaries operating in darkness. Operational strain manifested in subtle ways. Radar maintenance logs reveal increasing system fatigue. Components overheated from extended use. Replacement parts grew scarce as Allied advances constricted supply lines. Night fighter crews, often flying twin-engine aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110 or the Junkers Ju-88 configured for nocturnal interception, faced growing hazards. British countermeasures disrupted radio communications and navigation signals. Pilots reported disorientation in heavy clouds, compounded by jamming interference. One diary entry from a German night fighter pilot reads, "Engage target without visual confirmation. Tracer vanished into black. Return uncertain. Uncertainty corrodes professional confidence." American bombers might outgun or outnumber interceptors, but engagements were visible. British night operations obscured even the nature of contact. German high command feared the cumulative cost of this ambiguity. Every night required readiness, crews at posts, engines primed, radar arrays scanning. The economic toll of constant alert drained fuel reserves and maintenance cycles already strained by Allied advances. Anti-aircraft batteries guarding industrial hubs remained manned through freezing temperatures. Searchlight crews endured hours of monotony punctuated by sudden violence. Fatigue blurred judgment. Reports began to note misfires, delayed responses, and coordination lapses between radar sectors. These were not catastrophic failures. They were incremental degradations. Yet incremental degradation, repeated nightly, compounds into systemic weakness. The RAF's expansion into tactical night operations intensified this pressure. As Allied armies advanced through France and the Low Countries, British aircraft targeted rail yards and troop concentrations behind German lines after dark. Transportation schedules shifted under threat of disruption. Supply trains halted prematurely to avoid illuminated targets. The German concept of using night for redeployment, once a cornerstone of operational flexibility, eroded. Darkness no longer guaranteed concealment. In strategic conferences held in Berlin and regional headquarters, officers debated resource allocation. Should more fighters be diverted to nocturnal defense, weakening daylight resistance? Should flak coverage be concentrated over major cities, leaving peripheral infrastructure exposed? These were not hypothetical exercises. They were daily dilemmas. American bombers demanded strength by day. British night operations demanded vigilance by night. The Reich's capacity to sustain 24-hour defense narrowed steadily. What the German command feared most was not a single catastrophic night, but the realization that night itself had been weaponized against them. War, at its core, is a contest of endurance. If one side dictates the tempo across both day and night, the other loses the ability to recover. By 1945, German leadership confronted a reality in which no hour felt secure. Daylight carried the visible threat of American formations. Night carried the invisible persistence of British bombers and intruders. Between them, recovery became a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. By the final winter of the war, the distinction between tactical threat and existential pressure had blurred inside German command headquarters. What had once been categorized as an air defense problem was now recognized as a systemic vulnerability. British night operations had matured into a form of operational encirclement, not through ground maneuver but through time. German planners could no longer define a period of rest. Daylight demanded fighter deployments against American formations targeting oil plants and transport hubs. Night demanded an entirely different configuration of vigilance. Radar stations at full output, searchlight belts aligned along anticipated corridors, night fighter units fueled and armed, civil defense mobilized across industrial regions. It was not the spectacle of explosions that alarmed German leadership most. It was the exhaustion embedded in the routine. Intelligence summaries compiled in early 1945 indicate that RAF Bomber Command's evolving tactics were carefully calibrated to exploit this exhaustion. Raids were sometimes staggered, smaller probing attacks followed by heavier waves, forcing German defenders to remain on alert longer than anticipated. False radio traffic occasionally suggested imminent strikes in one sector, only for the main assault to fall elsewhere. Such maneuvers did not always yield spectacular destruction, but they amplified uncertainty. German commanders wrote of operational overextension, a phrase that implied a system stretched beyond sustainable elasticity. The oil crisis compounded the fear. By late 1944, synthetic fuel plants had already suffered repeated American daylight attacks. British night operations ensured that repair crews faced disruption and fresh damage before restoration could be completed. In reports to Albert Speer's ministry, field engineers noted that nocturnal raids delayed reconstruction timelines and interfered with rail transport delivering critical components. German armored divisions at the front felt these delays in diminished mobility. When fuel stocks dwindled, operational planning contracted. Night bombing, therefore, was not isolated from battlefield outcomes. It reverberated across theaters. Night fighter losses intensified the strain. Aircraft assigned to nocturnal interception missions operated under high-risk conditions with limited visual cues. British electronic warfare continued to degrade radar reliability. Crews trained intensively to interpret distorted signals, yet equipment limitations persisted. When interception succeeded, the engagement unfolded within narrow windows of contact illuminated by tracer fire or fleeting silhouettes. Survival rates reflected this hazard. Replacement pilots, often less experienced, entered units already operating under psychological fatigue. The German command understood that air defense was not merely a matter of hardware. It required human steadiness. Night eroded that steadiness. Civilian morale, though never openly acknowledged as a central pillar in official communiques, occupied quiet space in private memoranda. City administrators reported increasing absenteeism among factory workers after sustained nocturnal alarms. Sleep deprivation translated into decreased productivity and heightened accidents within industrial plants. The propaganda narrative emphasizing resilience faced the reality of cumulative strain. German leadership feared that night operations attacked not only infrastructure but the will that sustained it. Even as Allied ground forces approached the Rhine, British night intruder missions targeted retreating columns and airfields in Germany's western provinces. Luftwaffe bases, already struggling with fuel shortages, became exposed during landing approaches after dark. Pilots returning from sorties found runways intermittently strafed. The concept of sanctuary dissolved entirely. The German command had once relied on depth, geographic and temporal, to absorb shock. British night operations compressed that depth. American bombers, with their visible formations and defined corridors, presented a calculable threat. Loss projections could be estimated. Engagement zones could be mapped. British night operations denied such calculation. They exploited weather, darkness, and deception to fracture predictability. For commanders accustomed to strategic planning anchored in measurable variables, unpredictability posed a deeper menace than raw firepower. In the closing months of the war, German strategic discussions shifted from victory to containment. Even in this defensive posture, night operations remained a focal concern. They signified Allied capacity to sustain pressure without pause. When one side commands the day and the other fails to secure the night, equilibrium vanishes. The German command feared not merely defeat but disintegration, the slow unraveling of systems that once appeared formidable. As the Reich's territory contracted and supply chains collapsed, the psychological weight of night intensified. Every sunset signaled another cycle of alarm, radar sweeps, and uncertain contact. British night operations had transformed darkness into an active front, one that stretched across cities, airfields, railways, and the minds of those tasked with defending them. By March 1945, German command no longer debated whether British night operations were disruptive. The debate had shifted to whether they were survivable in the long term. The Western Front was fracturing under Allied pressure. Soviet forces were driving relentlessly from the east, and yet the nocturnal sky remained a contested theater in which the Reich could claim no decisive advantage. British aircraft did not need to level entire cities to achieve strategic effect. Their presence alone, sustained, methodical, unrelenting, had become a form of pressure that outlasted individual battles. German operational doctrine had long relied on rhythm. Offensives required preparation, reserves, and recalibration. Defensive lines depended on recovery intervals. Night, historically, provided that interval. Troops regrouped. Equipment was repositioned. Communications were reorganized. British night operations shattered that rhythm. Rail marshalling yards that once functioned under cover of darkness now operated hesitantly, often suspending activity after air raid warnings. Troop movements slowed. Repair crews delayed their tasks until daylight, ironically exposing themselves to American formations. The 24-hour cycle of war compressed into a continuous state of vulnerability. Within Luftwaffe headquarters, memoranda reveal an awareness that night operations were straining both material and morale beyond visible metrics. Radar stations reported degraded functionality not solely from damage but from wear, overuse without adequate maintenance. Anti-aircraft units documented increased fatigue-related errors. Night fighter squadrons, already depleted by attrition, rotated crews through longer duty periods to compensate for shortages. These adjustments appeared minor in isolation. Collectively, they signaled systemic fatigue. The psychological dimension was no longer abstract. German commanders understood that soldiers and civilians alike were experiencing cumulative stress from interrupted sleep and sustained alarm states. Medical reports from industrial centers indicate rising cases of nervous exhaustion among factory personnel and air defense crews. Such conditions did not immediately halt production or defense, but they eroded resilience. British night operations functioned as a slow lever, amplifying this erosion without requiring decisive destruction each sortie. American bombers remained devastating. Their daylight assaults inflicted tangible damage on oil refineries, transportation networks, and urban centers. Yet their visibility permitted a narrative of confrontation. German propaganda could frame daytime raids as duels in the sky, valiant interceptors challenging visible enemy formations. Night offered no such theater. Darkness concealed both attacker and defender. Engagements felt abstract and isolating. Civil defense shelters became spaces of suspended anticipation rather than communal defiance. In strategic assessments, German planners increasingly described Allied air operations as complementary rather than separate. American daylight raids degraded infrastructure. British night operations prevented restoration and compounded fatigue. Together, they formed an uninterrupted campaign. The German command feared this continuity more than the tonnage of bombs alone. Continuity denied adaptation. It forced perpetual reaction. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine, British bombers continued to strike transportation nodes and industrial sites deeper within shrinking German territory. Even as front lines collapsed, the nocturnal sky remained contested. For German leadership, this signified a grim reality. Control over one's own airspace had evaporated. A state that cannot secure its skies by day or night confronts not merely tactical setbacks but strategic dissolution. In the final weeks before Germany's surrender, reports from air defense sectors grew increasingly concise. There was less rhetoric, more arithmetic. Aircraft detected, flak expended, losses sustained. The tone suggested resignation. British night operations had become normalized as an unavoidable condition. Yet normalization did not diminish fear. It intensified it. An enemy whose presence is expected yet uncontrollable exerts a quieter, deeper pressure. When historians later assessed the collapse of German air defense, they noted industrial attrition and Allied numerical superiority. What internal documents reveal is subtler. The German command feared the erosion of control, the inability to restore equilibrium between attack and recovery. British night operations weaponized that imbalance. They transformed darkness into a domain of sustained vulnerability, one that eroded systems and spirit alike. The fear was not theatrical. It was calculated. It was recorded in memoranda, in maintenance logs, in the clipped phrasing of exhausted officers. And it persisted until the final nights of the war, when radar screens flickered over a Reich that could no longer defend its skies.